Nostalgia is something that can easily betray judgment. Sometimes we keep our childhood memories too close to ourselves, and we protect them from everything from the outside, in a desperate attempt at keeping our own rose-tinted version of the truth intact. But by doing so, we can often completely forget what the actual memory of it all was, and even start to dread returning to the place where those memories were born, in fear of tainting the illusion that we have. Pokémon as a franchise has always been one of the bigger victims of this. The games, the series, the IP as a whole has captured the childhood of so many of us. And most often than not, these first experiences become the favorites of many, the pick of the series for them. Yet I have never felt satisfied with such a way of thinking. I have a fascination for understanding this media, to see the games that I love, and understanding why I appreciate them so much, regardless of whether or not they were a part of my youth. While other games from the series have stayed behind as games that I appreciate but no longer feel a deep connection toward, Pokémon Mystery Dungeon Rescue Team has somehow still stayed as a game that I look fondly towards, for reasons above just being the game I played as a kid. There are things in this game that I find to be very special, a game that, in a lot of ways, I think I would have loved just as much if I played now for the first time. I want to talk about this game in a fair light, highs and lows, ugliness, beauty, and most of all, show what makes this peculiar spin-off so lovable to me. Now, let's go on a journey through Pokémon Mystery Dungeon Rescue Team and the beauty of its simplicity. There's a lot of topics to talk about, but I believe that it will be better to tackle the first thing people see when they arrive in this world. One of the most defining elements of the Pokémon Mystery Dungeon series for many is the starting step where you get your Pokémon. Perhaps a way the developers decided to create a bond closer between player and avatar, the Pokémon you get is picked according to your personality, which is determined through a quiz. There is something about this process that makes it feel very personal, something which I believe a lot of people really appreciate, considering the negative response some of the later entries got when it was removed or made optional. Yet at the same time, once you remove the mantle that covers the trick, you realize that it brings out a lot of implications with it. The quiz itself has some flaws ingrained to the way it's made, some more likely to be noticed by the player than others, such as the fact that there are more questions for certain personalities. Combine this with the fact that you will never get a questionnaire that has answers that boost each personality trait equally, and you have a system that most likely will be leaning towards one conclusion despite your input. There are some Pokemon from the pool that are gender locked as well, an arguable product of a different time. But even beyond all of this, the biggest issue that is born in the grand scheme of things comes from a result that, well, cannot be changed. A result that is also a difficulty setting. The starters in Red and Blue Rescue Team are not built equally. There is a lot of unbalance in what some get that others don't. Because the move pools of most Pokemon remain the same compared to their mainline counterparts, despite the engine changes meaning that these moves can get a lot stronger or weaker, a few Pokemon can learn moves that are drastically more powerful in the context of Mystery Dungeon. Absorb's ability to heal might be a neat bonus in the mainline games, but it can be an incredibly good source of sustain in the long run. Same with the utility of Charm, a 100% accurate move that stuns opponents for quite a while, even bosses. Or Fury Swaps, a multi-hitting attack that can easily take out most enemies with 3 or 4 hits in comparison to its underwhelming mainland counterpart. Because the main character will always remain with you, it is of utmost importance that they are the ones to carry strong moves, yet the game has already decided the lineup you will be having before even you know how important this was. It's an unfortunate side effect that will take a while before it was properly addressed in later entries. The personality quiz is a staple, I don't think anyone could say otherwise, but perhaps its importance has been a bit overblown ever since its inception. While I appreciate it when it appears, I also don't mind being given the option to choose a Pokemon, as it lets me go with just whatever my heart desires. There's an appeal to both ways to go about it, and I see this game as a great example of why heading towards only one of the directions without thinking too much about it can lead to problems that need to be taken care of first. But with that, the path is clear for the journey to start, one filled with adventures and fights, although perhaps leaning towards mostly one side for most players. Pokémon Mystery Dungeon is always remembered for its narrative side, and that is something that I deeply respect and understand. But I also believe there's a lot of merit to the games that chain these stories together, especially if you understand the context from where these games are born. So before we jump into the stories that everyone remembers, I would like to talk first about the adventures that exist in this game, and what makes them so appealing to me, despite some of the rocky terrain that might exist along the path. And what better place to start than the context of when these games came out. Starting off, Mystery Dungeon as a title is more than just something that Pokémon Rescue Team carries. It is a series of games that is mostly developed by Spike Chunsoft, formerly known as Chunsoft Company, and it's actually one of their longest running series. Known in Japan as Fushigi no Dungeon, this is, in essence, a different take on the concept that the game Rogue, released in 1980, showed to the world. A game about going through many floors of a procedurally generated dungeon, having a plethora of items, enemies, and the like all around the place, with the caveat being that if one were to lose, the punishment is severe, as it features a permanent death. In the first Mystery Dungeon game, roughly translated as Torneko's Great Adventure Mystery Dungeon, a Dragon Quest IV spin-off exclusive to Japan for the SNES, the main thing that separated Mystery Dungeon in its first iteration was a system of progression of sorts. While you lose everything once you leave the dungeon, such as level and basic items, after you successfully manage to beat or escape the place safely a few times, to find ways to keep some of your armor and weapon pieces and their respective upgrades, which will over time allow you to explore further in the dungeon, and therefore yet more things to upgrade yourself, which is basically the core that will become a staple of the series throughout all of the following games. With this first game being a success, not only did the game receive direct sequels, but the Mystery Dungeon brand was also used in other games, with the first follow-up being the first original IP to use the gameplay style, Shiren the Wanderer, which will become somewhat of a staple of Chunsoft. There were also two other existing series to get a Mystery Dungeon game of their own, one of them being Final Fantasy with Chocobo Mystery Dungeon, and the other being the Druaga series with the title of Nightmare of Druaga, Fushigi no Dungeon for the PS2. I won't be diving deeper into these games, but I wanted to bring them all up because their existence goes to show that Red and Blue Rescue Team were games made by a team who had already handled the idea of mixing its Mystery Dungeon formula with game series completely unrelated to it, and that there was a precedent for such combinations to work. I also mention this because Rescue Team might have some of the most crucial changes for the formula of this sub-genre to be more appealing for a larger audience. See, while these games are all fun in their own way, having played at least one entry of each of these series, I cannot deny that they require a very specific kind of player to be truly enjoyed. Progression is slow, things can get repetitive due to the lack of options. It can be frustrating to lose so much of what you need so easily. It's a genre that I think falls deep into the niche category. So to bring such a sub-genre to a franchise as popular as Pokémon, there was a tall order in trying to make this series more approachable for a less niche player base, yet I think not only did they succeed in this endeavor, they did so utilizing the strengths of the series that was accompanying them. One of the most important differences that Pokémon Mystery Dungeon has compared to other games is the way the core gameplay loop was slightly twisted, both for the sake of the console that the game was made for and to simplify things down. Extremely dangerous hazards such as traps are left for post-game, and the item lineup is simplified with straightforward but useful items, also removing things such as mysterious items that you didn't know what they did. Besides that, the introduction of a mission-based structure in the game exists as fuel for the player to be motivated to go back and revisit the dungeons that they have already beaten, which, on top of giving a purpose to already cleared dungeons, it is also a way for the player to get more opportunities to gather extra resources without feeling like they're just grinding for no reason. It might seem arbitrary from the outside, but an incentive is very often enough of a drive for players to go ahead and play through a dungeon again. It gives a purpose for the player to return and prepare themselves, with all of these extra items working as a failsafe for the adventure later down the line, which is crucial to lessen the frustration of failure while going through the tougher dungeons. Another element of major importance here is the way that moves have been implemented in the average exploration cycle. In most mystery dungeon games, you only really have one default attack, and most other offensive options come from your item lineup. This makes for an interesting resource battle, where you have to know how to regulate item usage, since overusing them or saving them up until it's too late are both things the game will punish you for doing. But it can also be argued to be monotonous, and a very limiting system for an already simple exploration game. For this, Rescue Team implements the ability to have up to 4 special moves you can carry with any of your Pokémon, with a wide variety of uses and abilities. This system not only creates a more varied combat, with these moves already doubling as a resource and a way for you to essentially have extra copies of a desired item, but it is also what leads to the side of Pokémon that appeals to so many people: the ability for your Pokémon to be your own, customizing their toolkit according to your move pool to suit your preferences and be more efficient. The game further motivates the player to use these special attacks with bonus experience, so you never have a reason to not use them. Lastly, the fact that this is not a single Pokémon adventure, but instead a journey of 2 or more, matters a lot more than it may initially seem. Your partner is an important part of your strategy, providing you with a plethora of options for them to handle the situations. Perhaps you want them as a shield to protect yourself, or you want them to assist with range attacks, or focus on utility moves such as status effects. There is also the fact that this creates a different dynamic, where you also have to consider the positioning in relation to what you want to accomplish, finding the sweet spot without putting either of you too much at risk. In some of the post-game dungeons, you can also switch between party members too, and they do not share their hunger, meaning that you can strategically divide which party member you actively use for each part of the dungeon. All of these systems generate a game that tries to mold the mystery dungeon ways into the player in a way that can make them feel more comfortable, while also bringing some of the positives that mainline Pokémon has. It is a clever set of changes that may not seem too obvious for people who just started with these games, but that feels massive in the way that they change the core formula of an already established series. Granted, none of this was introduced perfectly per se. I already mentioned how the starters and partners too are incredibly unbalanced in what they get in terms of move pool. The AI is also not great, which means very often they might not do what you want, wasting valuable resources in moments you don't want them to, or just making terrible decisions all around, unless you specifically go and fiddle with the menus often to avoid these instances, which can get quite time consuming. Lastly, while I love the set of tools that you are given in the form of attacks, I feel like it might have accidentally created a bad habit in people. Very often I see folks get stuck at certain points of the games in the series, and then notice that they carry basically the minimum amount of things that they probably should, afraid that if they bring more, they might either not be able to get more items from the dungeon, or even worse, that they might lose their current ones. So instead they rely exclusively on those moves that are always available for them. This misunderstands that items are not a luxury to get in this franchise, and that they exist to be used when the opportunity strikes. Fainting once or a few times isn't the end of the world, even if you carry good items, and I can assure you that chances are you will be able to live even if you lose a few oran berries or reviver seeds. With all of this being said, when I returned to this game after having all the context I had learned, I couldn't help but feel a bit impressed. Perhaps it's just my interest with the way developers in video games solve issues, but to look at the way this game seamlessly combined things to make a game that adapted to its new public is something that I can't help but find to be admirable, showing adaptability and understanding of the public they aim towards and the strengths of their own series. This is just something that I find very impressive all around. While all of these elements are the fundamental things that make this new gameplay loop of this game work, they are not all the pieces that are new to the game. There are a couple of other mechanics that are unique to this series, all of them seemingly related to trying to translate the Pokémon side of things into this world, with unfortunately mixed results. First, and perhaps the most prominent of these mechanics, is Pokémon recruitment. While an incredibly simple system in theory, just beat a Pokémon and they might join you, there are a decent amount of things to keep track of for a Pokémon to even have a chance for this to happen. And while some of these can be guessed or are thought by the game, such as having enough space on your party or needing the respective friend area, there's a few things about this system that are either not explained well enough or at all, and make this whole process more frustrating than needed. Things such as the fact that evolved Pokémon have negative recruitment rates at the start, meaning that you will need ways to boost your recruitment chances before even having a shot for them to join. or that most fully evolved Pokémon are straight up unable to be recruited. These are things that really had no reason to be there. Same with Pokémon size, a system that just limits some Pokémon with no benefit. Size even makes you unable to recruit most legendary Pokémon if you have 3 party members, which is the standard maximum, and the game never tells you about this, which feels incredibly mean towards the player. Another issue that presents itself with recruitment stems from the fact that it locks you out of getting some Pokémon before postgame for no reason. You may see the Pokémon, but their friend area might be locked behind the postgame, something that just feels unnecessary if you're going to create a system such as this. As a side note, I never particularly liked recruiting Pokémon in Mystery Dungeon, because it's just a grind until you get the lucky hit, with the only thing you can do to help that out is to increase your chance of recruitment, something that cannot be easily done in this particular entry. It's a fine system in future entries, but here it's unnecessarily cumbersome. On a topic related to recruitment, friend areas. Perhaps one of the most well-remembered features of this game, although I think a lot of that comes from a combination of nostalgia and aesthetic appeal. Friend areas are pretty places, and they also have a fair chunk of this game's original soundtrack, with some pretty catchy melodies that I honestly wish were used in an area of the game that you had more of a reason to stay. That being said though, a lot of these areas are honestly astonishing visually, with some very pleasing color schemes and a lot of cool set pieces and concepts, with a wide variety of themes. The Pokémon Mystery Dungeon series has always been good at creating visual treats for the player, perhaps as compensation to how generic the dungeons have to be in terms of layout and the like. I do wish you actually had a reason to stay and see these pretty landscapes though. They're awesome to look at, but they do feel like a bit of wasted potential. Besides leaving and getting your party members, the one reason you have to stay here for a bit is to give your team gummies. To say that gummies are game breaking will be quite the understatement. They're not precisely hard to grind, and in fact, visiting certain dungeons with the proper setup can let you fill your inventory with them, which means gaining 20 points in randomly distributed stats, besides HP, and some bonus IQ. For some reason, however, you actually cannot use this on either the protagonist or partner until the postgame, as they cannot be left in a friend area up to that point, and eating gummies while in a dungeon only increases IQ. This is a pretty nonsensical limitation, as the only argument I can see for it is to not let you break the game before postgame, but most dungeons let you bring a third party member regardless, and transforming that into your strongest asset is not hard either. Not only that, but the aforementioned IQ stat is very important, providing both a better AI for any teammate, and also some passive bonuses such as not activating traps the first time you step on them. And you want to give these bonuses to your most used characters, the protagonist and the partner. But it feels bad to do so when you know you're losing a lot of benefits simply because the game didn't feel like giving the two main characters that option until postgame. It's an odd choice, really. Lastly, and by far the least relevant thing here, as it is just a dumb quirk that carried over from melee Pokémon, there are HMs, a pointless lock to some of the postgame dungeons that requires you to have a respective HM move in some way to actually enter a dungeon, with the most egregious example being Silver Trench, a dungeon that needs both dive and a water type in your team. This is nothing but an old byproduct of taking one of Pokémon's most disliked mechanics and trying to bring it to this new game form. As a whole, Pokémon Mystery Dungeon really tried its hardest to bring in an experience that was worthy of being both a continuation of its own series and of the series it was crossing over, and I deeply respect it for it. I have pointed out some of the problems that it brought along, but to say that this game failed to deliver exactly what it wanted will be a lie. They managed to combine two genres with a degree of attention and care put into it that feels like a huge accomplishment. It is a sign that the people behind this series had something they wanted to make, that there was passion behind this project, and the best part about this passion is to note that not only is this game very fun and interesting to both watch and play, but there is also a lot of that passion behind the story that it wants to present. As a quick heads up, this video is assuming that you have already gone through at least the main story of this game. I know all of you are smart enough to realize this by this point, but I'm putting this warning here regardless because for the sake of pacing and to focus on the things I really want to talk about, I won't be giving a summary of the game's plot. And of course, because this part is going to be very heavy with spoilers. This section is structured for the people who already know the general gist of the things that happen in the game. To create a premise about Rescue Team's narrative being this incredible tale that has never been seen before, it would not only be dishonest, but also in a way go against what I truly love about this game nowadays. It won't surprise me if you may, perhaps, have seen a similar premise to this one in other places before or after seeing this game. A protagonist with no memory meets someone, quickly becoming friends and having adventures together. The journey moves forward, enduring tough trials throughout, all while slowly regaining their memory and their bond with their partner growing deeper. But in the end, after they finally regain their memories, a realization falls into the protagonist about their eventual separation from not only this world that has become their new life, but of the one who's been with them from the start, their partner. This is but a structure for many tales that you can find along the vast world of media, a tried and true formula that has stayed with us who knows how long. But the structure is just a piece of what makes a good story, and it will be foolish to just judge the narrative from that. I would like to dig a bit deeper than just that outline, and instead, see what makes this story stand out within those parameters. What does this game do right and wrong in terms of story and characters? What's there to see that stands out? The elements that compose the story as a whole have a similar mixture of origins when compared to its gameplay counterpart. A fair amount of the narrative presented uses actual information from Pokémon media's inspiration. A lot of Pokédex entries come up in this game, and they're used for either smaller, cute notes about the character, or big parts of the story that are born from these mythos that exist in the mainline games. The Ninetales Curse, Rayquaza's Domain, Gardevoir's protective nature, Satu's vision. You can really gather a lot of pieces of the Pokémon world in this game. The usage of these elements creates a solid foundation for the game to start, but of course, the bulk of the story isn't there, as these are just elements that are borrowed from the series. A series that, in certain aspects, clashes a bit with the elements that people like from Pokémon Mystery Dungeon in particular. You see, around this time Pokémon wasn't really a narrative heavy franchise, which has generally worked out for the series, as the gameplay and mechanics of such a genre are strong enough for people to want to play regardless of the narrative. And in a way, I think that could have worked for Rescue Team 2, and that is why I'm thankful about this game creating a narrative that, while perhaps not the most complex, aims towards creating something memorable. This game can be divided into 3 major arcs, those being the beginning, fugitives, and the climax of it all. While I don't have much to say about the beginning and the end of the game, as they are for the most part very standard situation of the day scenarios besides the ending, which I will mention later, I do think the fugitive arc deserves a mention due to how much it gets right. The middle point of the game is a part that really takes advantage of everything that the story has set up to this point. It uses the main mystery that has been presented all throughout the game and turns the entire premise on its head, creating doubt within the protagonist of their own identity, and this makes the position of the partner as the main pillar support of the protagonist even more important. There is the way that Gengar manipulates the information to turn everyone against us, as we are unable to defend ourselves in this situation. But we also see the ones that stand with us, the ones who believe on the person we have shown to be, with a very heartfelt farewell. It is a major moment of change from everything that came before. It is a wake-up call for the protagonists to defend themselves, to survive, and to prove to everyone else that trusting them was right. It is a perilous challenge that both the protagonist and the partner confront, with the partner always reassuring that things will be alright, that they believe in who we are, in the person who's been with them all this time, and in the end, all the effort pays off, finding irrefutable proof of our innocence, and making everyone else realize the manipulation that had gone through. There are a lot of little things in this section that I still get me when I get through it, from the way the partner cheer-ups, to the way the Pokémon who doubted us apologize. When you're proven innocent, everyone has their own dialogue apologizing, and I love reading through them all, to see that they care about the one that they wrong. It's something that makes me feel like not only have I regained their trust, but have also made it stronger than ever before. Besides the fugitive arc, however, one of my favorite moments in the story relates to probably the most unredeemable character throughout the main game, Gengar. A character who comes off as bad-mannered, evil for no reason, and aggressive throughout the story, but that we slowly get to learn about his situation. The Curse of Ninetales, the story of a boy who was meant to be cursed, was protected by his partner Gardevoir, someone who deeply cared about them, yet he still ran away, leading to a curse that transformed them into a Pokémon, and for Gardevoir to be sealed. It is an unresolved plot point that the main story has, although by the end, it is very clear how Gengar fits in this whole thing. And in the post-game, Gengar asks for help to find a way to remove this curse. And with the directions Ninetales gives us, we go to a place where he is to be judged for his actions. But the person who is to answer for his forgiveness is us, one of the people who have been most directly affected by his chaos. Yet even if you try to help Gengar out, forgiving his past mistakes, the reality is that there was no way for us to actually lift that curse. And in that realization, Gengar breaks down. He finally says everything that was going through his mind, what his heart truly felt, the regrets he had, the realization he had when he heard Gardevoir say how much he still cared about him, and about the gratitude that he was missing for his partner. It is perhaps my second favorite story moment in the game, mainly because, well, I wanted Gengar to not just be a bad guy. In a lot of ways, Gengar is a parallel of the protagonist, someone who doesn't regard the rest of the world, living selfishly and causing problems for everyone else. But through reflection about his own actions and a realization that he only got by being the way he is, a change starts to happen within him. While Gengar gets a happy ending, he only does so after learning about himself, about the problems he had as a person, and despite being forgiven, the partner that made him realize all of this is gone, their bond only remembered by him. Yet the final moment we get with Gengar really says it all. He has changed, and perhaps one day we'll be able to blossom a similar companionship to Gardevoir, now being able to treasure the value of such a partnership. Partnerships play a huge role in this franchise, and the lead duo of this game was definitely a great starting point. It's interesting, really, to think about the main character of the game on its own. Pokémon Mystery Dungeon takes a very curious approach to their protagonist. As despite being an avatar of the player, they do have a very clear canvas of the kind of person who they are, not being quite the empty slate we often associate with player characters. Very often we see their thoughts. They want things to be right, they will always do the right thing, and they will do as much as possible if they can to help somebody. But they aren't heroic in a way that might feel alienating. There is a sense of reservation to the character, on who they are, what they're here for, and an insecurity that constantly follows them, to the point of thinking that perhaps they were the person who was cursed by Ninetales. This defined personality I think helps out a lot, not only to create a bond with them as a character, but for them to bounce off the other piece of the duo, the partner. The partner is but a simple-minded person. They believe in our absurd tale, and grow a bond with us incredibly quickly, always motivating us to go forward, and to believe in ourselves in the times of doubt. They push the protagonist further, to believe in themselves as much as they believe in us, as the strength of partner show stems from being together with us. It is a very pretty relationship they have, to push one another's back, to believe that things can be done to make this world better, and to trust in one another for what they have seen, never giving up in one another. It's a strong bond that will forever exist between the two, which is why it's heart-shattering to eventually learn of the inevitable separation we will see, and even more so, to actually live it. It is not surprising that the ending stays with people. This is not only a strong story beat just because of the soap opera factor, but because it is the breaking of everything we were slowly building upon. What makes people look back upon this scene is not just what is happening at the moment, but the way that everything you slowly built before starts to fall apart into pieces, and to see the pain that this pair of friends had to endure, separating paths to their destiny. Even if you know things will eventually be fixed, that doesn't mean anything in the context of the moment, of what the characters on screen are going through. To think about abandoning someone that they care about so much, it's a very genuine scene to me. It's the person who looks upon the screen and says goodbye to their partner. However, even with all of this being said, I perfectly understand the people who do not consider this game's narrative anything too impressive. It is but an old tale, filled with many standard story tropes, and even a pretty major issue in one of the bigger plot points. I didn't mention it before, but despite being a very special moment to me, the fact that Gengar is the human that is related to the Ninetales course creates an issue where the longest and most emotionally nuanced part of the narrative is more or less pointless in terms of advancing the plot. By the end of the Fugitive arc, the only thing we have learned at this point is that the one lead we thought we had was wrong, so we return to wondering who we are and how we fit in this world. Combine this with arguably the worst part of the game in terms of gameplay, at least from the main story, and you have what should be the best part of the game become a mixed bag of an emotionally charged, yet as a whole, pointless narrative section. But despite my understanding of such things, and seeing the flaws that break the story for others, I think it's a whole other thing to call this game shallow. I find the positive elements of the story still salvageable and memorable. There is enough in this world for people to care about the world that exists and the characters that live in it. It is the most simplistic story in this whole series, but it is also one that I believe they wanted to tell, and that was absolutely worth hearing out. Because, well, despite everything, in the end, to see this beam of light share my feelings, to want to return to the world that they love so much, and to be with the friend that means so much for them, that is a story that I still find worth looking at, and that makes me smile to this day. While the story and gameplay are the crucial elements for the game to be able to stand on its own 2 feet, I believe it will be unwise to ignore the elements that surround this core. Pokémon Mystery Dungeon's art style is an evolution of the style presented in all the pixel art Mystery Dungeon entries before, a style tried and true to this very day if we are to see Sheeran vibe. While perhaps simple in animation, it also manages to translate an insane amount of creatures to a much smaller canvas than what they were used to, which is an impressive feat on its own. It is a charming art style that has honestly stood out the test of time quite well. A big portion of the visual flair also comes from the scenes that the game wants you to see. Some moments in the game present these great shots of the world to present the scale of it all in a way that just entering dungeon wouldn't let you. It is a game that is not afraid of showing you the beauty it can have when it wants to be. Dungeons are simplistic in structure and art, but that's where the other side of a good atmosphere in a game plays a major role: the music. While perhaps controversial, I must admit that a part of me feels like for the most part, the music in Rescue Team is fine. It is a soundtrack that most often works at setting the ambience of the dungeon, but I don't think much about outside of the game. Tracks such as Mount Steel, Thunderwave Cave, and Silent Chasm work fine as ambient noise, but there isn't enough for me to go out of my way to listen outside of the game. However, exceptions exist to a general rule, and as time has moved forward, I have slowly been able to point down the kinds of songs that truly excel, and there's no better example than A Journey Through the Great Canyon. Rescue Team's soundtrack is one that I believe shines the most when prioritizing one of the words of its title, mystery, to create a song that not only fits the location that it is showing you, but that it presents it as a place full of mystique and wonder. Some of the later dungeons are separated into 2 parts, with the second half having their own track. I think that worked for the benefit of the game, as the first part of a dungeon sets the mood while starting it, and then the second part can transform the song into something different, to create a familiar yet still new atmosphere. Mount Thunder sets a great precedent on what you can do with the setup, but I think it truly shines on the next dungeon to utilize it, Mount Blaze, transforming an already very good track for this fiery dungeon into a beautiful and foreboding song about reaching the end, and the tension from a desperate escape. Honestly, Great Canyon and Mount Blaze Peak are easily my favorite dungeon tracks in the game, but it will be a disservice to not mention arguably the most iconic song of the game, Sky Tower, the final dungeon of the main story. Yet as much as I love this song, I do prefer its perhaps less grandiose brother, the Sky Tower Summit. It is a perfect track to capture the mixture of feelings that the protagonist is feeling, their determination to save this world, the sadness of knowing what will come after, and the mysticism around the legendary Pokémon such as Rayquaza. In a lot of ways it reminds me of the song Legend of Ninetales, which is yet another song I heavily relate to this game, as it truly encapsulates the feel that this game's story has. A legend, a story that passes down from generation to generation, about a human who didn't believe in themselves capable of saving the land, asking to truly be tested, and that in this test gained more than the courage to confront the calamity, because they also obtained the trust of the people they were saving. On the topic of cutscene music, it wouldn't be fair to not mention the other candidate for the most iconic song in the game, Runaway Fugitives, one of the most emotionally charged tracks, for a moment filled with so many feelings. It is fitting that such a song will be fondly remembered to this day by so many, although I do believe that other songs do also deserve some more love, such as World Calamity or Aftermath. So don't misunderstand my words at the start. The songs that I love from this game are dearly engraved to my heart, just like many other favorites from future entries. I may consider the overall soundtrack just fine, but there are some tracks that still manage to excel and shine. I think it's a combination of these standouts, of the narratively solid moments, and the visual highlights for the big situations that the game presents to the player are what truly makes this game feel bigger than it perhaps would be otherwise. It is a phenomenal atmosphere that goes a long way into making this adventure feel like something special, which is what I believe they wanted it to be. Originally, the way I wanted to go about this video was to go through the entire game giving commentary about it. An idea that, while sounding concept, made me realize I would burn through a lot of time in elements that aren't particularly relevant to what I am aiming to show, so I opted against that decision. Yet to cut off the personal experience aspect will feel like a disservice to a game that is so heavily focused on it, so allow me to borrow a few minutes of your time to point out some of the highlights of this adventure. Visiting this game again, knowing both the past and the future of the series, created a different bond that I had with this entry compared to before. There is a lot to respect from how much it learned from its predecessors in the inception of the ideas that live in this game, and so much to see in the way that it evolved from these older incarnations. With my protagonist Enka the Mudkip and their partner Maku the Pikachu, I expected the journey to be straightforward, with the only real dangerous wall being the early game Zapdos. Yet I found myself in trouble a somewhat higher amount of times than expected. Some of the areas truly lent to annoyance, particularly related to Maku and his learn set being so heavily leaning towards electric type moves, making the fact that some of the dungeons had Pokémon with the ability Lightning Rod incredibly inconvenient, more or less shutting him down entirely on those floors, and of course, the AI didn't really catch on to that. It was also a reminder of an era of Pokémon mystery dungeon that feels antiquated nowadays. Before Super went and changed the importance of items, as a lot of them are heavily diminished in terms of usefulness here in comparison to future entries. Orbs being unusable on bosses, blast seeds dealing a pitiful amount of damage, and generally having a much weaker lineup of useful tools, made the staple items that are always strong such as reviver seeds borderline broken, in a way that I don't particularly know how to feel about, especially when it came to the Fugitive arc, probably my least favorite part of the game in terms of gameplay. This section of the game is just frustrating to me, mainly because it puts you in a place where you are unable to get the most useful item to advance against bosses that for the most part are just stat checks. Despite my resistance to its main offensive move, Articuno was able to one-shot me with ease multiple times, and forced me to grind in a situation where I'm pretty sure I was on a perfectly reasonable level to either. And the fact that you let Absol after both this and Moltres' fight is just insult to injury at that point, as there is only one dungeon left in the arc and it doesn't even have a boss. On the topic of the third party member, well, for a decent portion of the game I just used whoever I felt like having on the team. I got lucky and managed to get an Apom before the postgame. Apom and a few other Pokemon have access to the ability Pickup, which completely turns the game on its head, giving you a constant flux of items per floor explored. It's one of the most game-breaking abilities you can have in a mystery dungeon game, so I, the Apom, went ahead and stayed with us for the final piece of the story. By the time I reached the finale, I was pleasantly satisfied with the results of this revisit. While still a flawed game in a few aspects, I do believe there are just as many special things here to look back upon as my memory told me there were. It made me open my eyes about the side of a series that I hadn't seen before, and it was even better knowing that I wasn't even done with the adventure, not even close, in fact. There is a curious thing with the Mystery Dungeon franchise, but especially with this particular subseries of games in it, and that is the fact that most people will not know about the more or less second half that the game contains. While lengthy post games are not something exclusive to this franchise, it's very interesting to see how much these games hide away from the casual player so as to not alienate them, which in this case was most likely the correct choice, as bloated is the first word that comes to my mind when I think about the Rescue Team post game. While the idea of more than doubling the amount of dungeons is attractive, there are a lot of excess dungeons that have no particular goal or purpose other than finding very niche Pokémon or items that you will ever need a few, if any. This is particularly noticeable with the dungeons filled with evolution items, or HMs, and it makes a lot of them start to blend in your mind, as plenty of these dungeons also utilize similar, if not basically the same tileset, something that is egregiously noticeable with the water dungeons that become so predominant around here. Another fairly common thing are 99 floor dungeons that overstay their welcome, something incredibly noticeable as you contrast most dungeons being around the 30 floor threshold, with only 2 dungeons having anything between 50 and 98 floors. It's an obscene jump that the game doesn't prepare you properly and expects you to be ready in a way that doesn't feel great to go through. Although luckily, it is possible to be ready as long as you know how to take advantage of what the game offers you. Between gummies and pickups, I could basically boost any Pokémon I wanted into an overpowered status. I went ahead and picked Porygon due to it being one of the only 2 Pokémon to have access to Recycle in this generation, a move that lets you reutilize TMs, which combined with the ability to have the same move multiple times, let Porygon go around spamming long range attacks as much as it wanted. And honestly, a hilarious strategy to go with either in this game or Explorers, and in that one it's even more accessible thanks to Recycle being a TM. This breaks the post game entirely, but due to the schizophrenic and open-ended nature of it, it's hard for that to not happen accidentally anyways, so I just went ahead and bit the bullet for the sake of having a more fun experience. Due to gummies, TMs and IQ being entirely reliant on you, chances are that you will focus all of your resources on a main character to utilize. But at least the door is open for basically every Pokémon to have a shot. Evolution in this franchise is as irrelevant as it gets, to the point where I haven't mentioned it for that exact reason, as it doesn't provide particularly relevant benefits for the most part. So beating everything with a favorite is as simple as just giving them enough stats to go through anything you want. You can go ahead and just beat some legendary beasts with Caterpie if that makes you happy. It's a fun quirk the game has that carried on to all other Pokémon Mystery Dungeon games, and I kinda love just being allowed to break the game in whatever way I want. With all of that being said though, most of the preparation is but worthless for the actual tough challenges in the game, as the difficult dungeons in the game, Wish Cave, Joyo's Tower and Purity Forest, reset your level back to 1 alongside your stats and IQ, although you don't really have to clear Joyo's Tower as the few unique things it has can be obtained by just reaching floor 50, so you can just leave after that. Purity Forest, however, doesn't even let you bring items or other party members, making it by far the toughest challenge that requires both good planning and an absurd amount of luck for things to go right. I went ahead and cleared all the dungeons at least once for the sake of experiencing everything, and this was easily what took me the longest. Yet there is a lot of fun in just exploring Mystery Dungeon, perhaps a fun that is unique to my preferences in games, but the one that always gets me excited to just go back to the game and explore these places that may prove too tedious for most. While the overall narrative is over by this point, there are still small individual stories that are linked to some of these dungeons. Most of these are completely unrelated or just very loosely related to the events throughout the main story, as well as the one mentioned before about Gengar and Gardevoir. A fair amount of these stories are very mundane, not much going on besides some strong Pokémon appearing in a determined area, and you having to beat them. But I do appreciate a few of them, mainly the search of Ho-Oh for Spinda and the Lady Twins quest, which shine in their own special way, with the Spinda quest even having a special ending if you go ahead and interact with them while using Ho-Oh, whereas the Lady quest is one of the few with stakes that feel relevant, due to Latias potentially being trapped forever due to the meteorite hitting her, and Latios being willing to sacrifice himself for her to not suffer as much, but thankfully ending well, and having some very cute and happy notes by the end. For the rest though, the stories are more or less just tiny excuses to visit some of the extra dungeons, which if anything is perfectly fine. Lastly, I do want to address the 2 things that I didn't do in this run for completion, those being full Pokemon recruitment and reaching Lucario rank. The latter is extremely simple. Rank is completely irrelevant in this game, and it's not fun to just pointlessly grind for an absurdly high amount of rank points when there isn't even some kind of reward. On a similar note, Pokemon recruitment is something that just takes an absurd amount of time for something that has no real purpose besides bragging rights, While I love playing through these games, I don't consider either of these accomplishments to be things that feel worth getting, due to them boiling down to tedious grind games with minimum payoff. And if my grind-heavy mindset doesn't want to complete this, I severely suggest that unless you're absolutely certain that you will find some enjoyment out of it, you don't do it either. As a whole, it's interesting to think about the post-game, as it comes with a mixed bag which in order to truly enjoy to the fullest, you'll have to be willing to not only play for quite a while, but to do a lot of preparation for things to start becoming more enjoyable. It's a tough pill to swallow for most people, but I do believe that if you're remotely interested in Mystery Dungeon as a game series, you give it a shot for a little while at least. Stockholm Syndrome is one hell of a weapon, if anything. Throughout this entire video, I have avoided mentioning the 2020 Switch remake of this game, Pokémon Mystery Dungeon Rescue Team DX. While I do have a fair amount of things to say about this game regarding the way it changed the gameplay compared to the original, I do believe such comments are not fitting for a video about the color duology. I am not opposed to, in the future, talking about this remake in its own separate video, and whether or not I consider it the definitive way to play the game, but that will be left for perhaps another day. Times have changed, haven't they? It is inevitable to compare older things to what we have now. It is but a sign of progress, yet it can still feel unfair for things that are from back then. Pokémon Mystery Dungeon Rescue Team is a game that is very dear to me, even more now that I look at it with the eyes of a person that knows about its legacy, a legacy that had to clean up the mistakes that this game fell into for the sake of making a path. I cannot say with a clean conscience that this game has aged perfectly, nor do I think that this is a game that everyone will enjoy the same way I do. I am used to its limitations, I am more forgiving to its mistakes. It is but an inevitable bias to have to a game one cares so much for. Yet despite all of this, I believe that if the game grabbed me back then, it wasn't a coincidence that I decided to cling into it. I believe plenty of other people have seen, or perhaps will eventually see the luster in this game, despite the rough exterior. There is something special here, and playing through it again has done nothing more than to confirm this thought in my mind. I sometimes see people become afraid to look back upon the games they love from their past, the games that changed them. They live in fear of finding the flaws of something they love, that learning this new truth will make the memory of the past but a lie, one that only existed from ignorance. It's an understandable fear, yet not one I can resonate with. To look back upon the things we love is to learn about why we love them, as opposed to blinding ourselves to a dream that never existed. It helps us learn about what we like, about what we enjoy experiencing, and to see what we appreciate in games more when we look for it. Rescue Team is a simple game, one with a fairly straightforward story, and a simplified gameplay loop to attract newer players into this exotic genre. It's a game that wears its simplicity proudly, and that instead of trying to obscure it, they show it front and center from the start. It's an honest experience through and through. What you see is what you get, and I believe that what you see is something worth experiencing. We should embrace the things we loved in the past. We must grow and learn from them. And while Rescue Team is not the masterpiece that perhaps I thought it was at some point, it's still a game that I adore, and that makes me happy to see again. Like an old friend that I don't see often, but that I know it's got my back. I love this game, and I will never stop doing so. And I hope that I was able to show why in this video. From the straightforward but still solid narrative, the character relationship that makes this tiny world one that I still care for, to an addictive gameplay despite the numerous holes. It's a game that believes in its own ideals and went with it, believing in all of its strengths to shine through. It is this, and everything that I have mentioned throughout this video, what I find to be the simple beauty of Pokémon Mystery Dungeon Rescue Team, a game that will forever remain in my memory. Thank you. I'm not a YouTuber, in case that hasn't been clear throughout this video. This is my first attempt at making something big like this, and I am definitely aware that it has some things that could be better. If you have any constructive feedback that you would like to give, I will highly appreciate it. That is all, and have a phenomenal day.